Hello, I'm Soycat and welcome back to the second channel geography video. This is a series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff, except when I'm talking about the world and stuff on this channel, I'm usually only talking about the top 50% of the globe, the Northern Hemisphere as it is actually known, because when you slice the globe in half, most of the people, in fact you watching this video, probably live in that Northern Hemisphere, and most of the countries, most of the land area, and most of the economy ends up on the top half of the globe. And this is kind of interesting because it means that the global south is kind of underrepresented on the internet and in general. And although there's reasons for that, because again, obviously if all those other things don't line up, it does still kind of mean that, you know, even though half of the world exists down here, you know a lot less about it than the Northern Hemisphere. Most of the world's famous countries are in the Northern Hemisphere. In fact, the three major powers in the world, you could say, the US, the EU, and China, are all entirely in the Northern Hemisphere. So I figured with today's video, why not talk about exactly what's going on south of that line by talking about every single country south of the equator, every single country in the Southern Hemisphere, and giving you at least one fact about them so you can learn a bit more about each of them and you can understand the global south a bit better. Because fun fact, the Southern Hemisphere, every single country there has their seasons flipped. And a lot of the winds, by the way, also are flipped. A lot of the, temperatures and stuff also flip, which means that if you are in, for instance, Australia, you can celebrate Christmas in the, in the summer heat with a barbecue or whatever. It's a common thing. And there's a lot of just tiny things like that you don't realize until you talk about the global south. So let's talk about every single country one by one. Again, mostly focusing on them as a country, not them in the south, but it kind of helps you understand what's in the south of the world. So we're going to start with Ecuador because it's a good example of one, the fact that the Southern Hemisphere is divided by the equator. Again, literally, Earth is roughly a sphere object. You cut it in half, down the middle, that's what the equator is. And Ecuador is literally, Spanish for equator. So it's named after the equator on which it lies, and it mostly is below the equator. Today, we're only be talking about countries which are mostly or entirely below that line of the equator, because some countries have the tiniest bit of territory, or the tiniest bit of thing. Today we're only talking about countries that are mostly down there, like Ecuador. So yeah, the fun fact about Ecuador is the fact that it's named after the equator, which is kind of cool for today's video. It's also worth noting, a lot of people don't know this, but the Galapagos Islands, the ones that are famous for, Charles Darwin's evolution theory, are a part of Ecuador. They're pretty well separated from Ecuador. They're all the way over here, but the Galapagos Islands are a part of Ecuador, and yeah, without these weird islands, which are well apart from everything else, we wouldn't have that kind of thing. And given that later on, we're going to be talking about a lot of island countries, which just happen to be in the south. In case you think they're kind of useless, without these islands, we wouldn't have the theories on which a lot of the world argues and or is based on. So yeah, with that said, let's move to the second country, which is mostly in the Southern Hemisphere. Because again, when you look at the equator and you look at Brazil, you start to realize that like it's super southern. And in fact, most of Brazil, even the parts north of it, because technically speaking, any country divided by the equator, they have a like right now it is autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. I had to check that one, which means that it's spring in the Southern Hemisphere. So some of Brazil right now is in spring, some is in autumn. Again, practically speaking, even when it's summer and winter, they just all kind of have the same season, because along the equator, it doesn't matter too much. Your day-night is pretty close to even. But it is an interesting thing that they technically have two sets of seasons in Brazil, even if they don't treat it that way. Also worth noting is Brazil is one of the most, again, famous, influential countries in the Southern Hemisphere. In fact, it's the, most, populated, blah, blah, blah. And I would say it is, because I could tell you a billion facts about, like, Brazil and how big some of its cities are and how it has some of the most populated cities in the entire Southern Hemisphere. But I could also tell you about the fact that, because so many facts about Brazil you can learn. So let me give you my prediction about Brazil, because Brazil is in the BRICS group of, fast-growing countries. Not traditionally doing well, but will do well in the future. I think Brazil is one of the countries that as soon as, we get better at, linking land together and terraforming and all that sort of stuff, Brazil has so much land that is just untapped and kind of used right now, and so many problems with using, in the places that are used, that I think Brazil in 100 years is one of those countries that could go from where it is now to global superpower, or at least Brazil and the South American countries that go along with it. Because it's worth noting as we move into Bolivia right now that because Bolivia is named their country is named after Simon Bolivar. He was basically one of the freedom fighters of South America. To very much simplify things and not really get a perfect comparison, it's kind of like the American Wars of Independence. He did that, but for all of South America. So you notice how Bolivia is named after the same thing that the Venezuelan currency is named after, and these fun facts just go on and on and on, for instance. So yeah, Bolivia, named after the Bolivar. Also, by the way, it's one of the two landlocked countries in South America, the other one being Paraguay right here. So yeah, Paraguay and Bolivia are both landlocked. They're the only two countries in the entire world which are landlocked outside of Africa, Europe, and Asia, the Afro-Eurasian landmass as it's known, because they're all connected to each other. On these, on this big continent, you'll see a lot of landlocked countries. Outside of that, in America, the Americas, let's call it, as well as Australasia and anything else you want to say, there are no other landlocked countries besides Bolivia and besides Paraguay. So there you go, fun fact for you. So moving back up to Peru, because Peru is, I feel like it's one of those, again, really famous South American countries. Everyone goes there at one point, you see YouTube videos there from whatever. However, I want to just mention that Peru is mostly covered in the Amazon rainforest. Most people think that because Brazil is famous for the Amazon and because they literally have a state, it's the state of Amazonas, like, oh yeah, so Brazil equals Amazon, right? Well, no, I mean, Jeff Bezos equals Amazon, but besides awful jokes aside, Peru actually has a lot of the Amazon rainforest too. In fact, looking at the Amazon rainforest, you can see how it doesn't really line up with national borders in the slightest. And yeah, it's something like 2/3 of Peru's landmass is covered by the Amazon forest, which means that only 5% of the population lives in this, 66% of their country. Most of their country lives by the sea. And as another fun fact about Google Maps in particular, because that's what we're doing right here today, Peru, their capital is listed as the Lima district, but according to any other source I can find, it's just Lima, the city as a whole. I don't know why only one district of their capital it shows up as their capital on Google Maps, but it does, and there you go. Fun fact about the tool we're using today. And actually, just for a fun little switch things up, let's switch over to satellite for the rest of this, so you can see what the actual world's looking like as we're doing this, because you can always see like near the equator as we do all of this. But let's move into the next South American country, because I wanted to talk about Chile. Chile is one of the most fascinating countries, which I guess we actually kind of need to see the satellite view, the map view for this one, because Chile is one of the tallest countries for its width in the world. You can see the height of Chile from south to north is really, really absurd, and because of the fact that it claims some of Antarctica, it has like the ratio of height to width is one of the biggest in the world. It's one of the very tallest countries in the world. It's right up there in the very, very top of them. And there you go. Have you ever thought to yourself, I wish there was a tall country? The answer is probably not. And the reason there aren't many tall countries, because most countries expand wider than they do tall. The best example is Russia, right? It just goes all the way. It just keeps going east. You just keep going east until eventually you get close to Russia again. And the reason that that's possible is because, generally speaking, for most of history, it makes sense to have countries with similar climates, because climate can lead to culture, and culture leads to nation state, etc. But Chile is the biggest exception to that rule, having a huge spread in the temperatures, the climates, the peoples, etc. as you go north to south. Another country that does a similar thing, but it's a bit fatter, so you don't notice as much, is Argentina. So Argentina, I'm going to give you the fun fact, because a lot of people are going to be like, oh, so you're going to talk about that whole thing? No, I want to talk about the fun fact that Argentina is one of the first countries to give birth on Antarctica. So the reason they did this is because, as you can see right here, Argentina, the UK, and Chile, we have a little bit of disagreements, as it seems, about exactly what's going on with Antarctica. Again, most of the claims, they're just claimed by one country. That's kind of that. New Zealand, Australia, France, okay, easy. There's a bit of unclaimed stuff as well. But then, as you can see, the three countries here disagree. And although the UK and Chile, we're pretty much chilly about, or eat about it, Argentina is very much asserting their claim. And the way they do that is by sending babies to be born on Antarctica. It's really absurd. It's dangerous to the mother involved, but it's kind of cool. Again, I wouldn't say it's a good idea. In fact, I'd say it's a very much bad idea. I don't like that it's happening, but it's kind of cool, right? You have to give it like that, at least some number of points. So yeah, there are babies being born in Antarctica every now and then to prove that it's Argentina's soil, although it doesn't prove anything to anyone. They just go for a lot of effort to kind of make that happen. So yeah, next up we'll talk about Uruguay, and this is interesting because, this isn't necessarily a geography fun fact. I don't usually care too much about football, or the soccers as you might call it, if you're outside of Europe, or if you're in America, let's be honest. But the interesting thing about football is if you look at the winners of the World Cup, which I believe we have right over here, you'll notice how it's only won by like European countries and South American countries. And the South American countries haven't won it in quite some time, besides like Brazil. And Uruguay is always on the list of World Cup winners. Have won more times, by the way, than England or than Spain. And that's because they played it very early on when the sport wasn't too developed. So yeah, Uruguay, a country with a population absurdly low, by the way. It's about 4 million. They have won the World Cup more times than a country with 40 million, and especially more times than a country with 300 million, and even more times than a country of 1.3 billion population. And that's mostly because they got in there early, because South America is just a country that is, they're big on their football, as it turns out. And fun fact, Uruguay, big part of that. They got that, joining a competition early and then like kind of having that forever is one of the big benefits of playing in something like the World Cup nice and early. So with that said, let's move on next to talking about, okay, so that's every South American country covered, unless you want me to talk about the colonies. But like I said, I'm not talking about countries that are only partially below the equator, because otherwise, if you want to talk about like the Falkland Islands, it's not a country, it's a part of, oh wait, it might be part of Argentina to you. It's a part of either Argentina or the UK. I guess South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, much easier situation. It's a part of the UK, right? Okay, so let's talk about it. But the UK, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, this is just like an outreach post. It's a tiny bit of land. It's not really a Southern Hemisphere country, which is why we're going to ignore a lot of colonies in the south, and instead we're going to move on to the the African countries, because a decent amount of Africa is south of the equator. Not most of it. Most of it is north in the sub-Saharan area. However, if you go south, you find a lot of countries here. So again, only talking about countries mostly below the equator, which in this case includes the DRC, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The DRC is it's a country that I like to bring up because whenever colonialism comes up, a lot of people assume that I am defending colonialism, because all I say, by the way, is like, oh yeah, don't assume it was an all bad thing. It is not objectively bad on every level. There are good bits and there are bad bits, and probably, in most cases, the bad bits outweigh the good bits. That's all I'm saying, and people go, so you're colonialist, right? And you're British, so therefore you want to colonize Africa again. It's like, oh my god, man. You can't have a complex, opinion on the internet, or people try to, tear you to the ground for it. However, the DRC is one of those situations where this is the, if you say all colonialism is awful, then I guess the DRC colonialism is just as bad as, like Canada or Australia or something. And yeah, DRC is, again, look into it sometime if you want to have a horrifying evening. I won't tell you too much, but I'll just say it was owned by Belgium. It was one of Belgium's only colonies. They technically had some other tiny states elsewhere, but it was Belgium's big colony that was a personal possession of their king at the time. So their king is just like, I want to make some mad money, and he gets it agreed with the other, European powers that this slab of land should be his. So that's crazy to begin with, but then he abuses the slab of land. Again, he has no interest in developing a country there. He has no interest in really even long-term profit. He's just like, I want money, I want it fast. I gotta bribe people, I gotta do all this sort of stuff. And along the list of atrocities is the fact that he chopped off a lot of hands. The number of chopped off hands in the Democratic Republic of Congo is so depressing. You might think like, oh yeah, so we're talking like, what is that like? Like he chopped off like, 50 hands or 500 hands. Wow, that's a lot of hands. No, we're talking millions of hands, because for every bullet you shot, you had to chop off a hand. It was a whole... Basically, DRC is one of the biggest messes of a colonial thing, and if you want to point to be like, oh yeah, so colonialism bad, this is a good example. Don't be like, oh yeah, that one country that does really, really well today because of these past actions, that's colonialism at its worst. No, look at DRC and be like, yeah, that's the peak. That's the bottom of the dip, and everything else is kind of a step up from there. So, similarly enough, you might notice how there's two countries called the Congo. There's the Congo, and there's the Congo, and they're both Republic of the Congo, except this one's democratic, and this one, I guess, apparently is not. However, again, interesting split there. The basic split is that, this part of the Congo was owned by the French, this part was owned by the owned by the Belgian king, and then by Belgium, and then, eventually became independent. So, yeah, what we're talking about, the Republic of the Congo, it was owned by the French, and they are the smaller version, but generally speaking, the better off version. And it's not hard to be given the history, but it is worth noting that. Also, their capitals, Brazzaville and Kinshasa, I can't say it right now, but they're very, very close to each other with no fixed link. Even though they're two countries that are very close by, as you might expect from the name, even though their capitals are right next to each other and they're both major metropolitan areas, they are not connected by anything but air. You take a flight from one to the other, and I can't believe that's still the case. You can take the ferry too, but it's really unreliable. I can't believe that in 2018, 2019 almost, that is still the case, but it is. It's one of these things where I want to bring it up from time to time, just to really drag home how ridiculous that is. So, next up we have Gabon here. Gabon is a French former colony, and it's also a pretty weird looking country, right? Is that enough facts for you? I hope it is. It's one of the countries that's only obviously partially below the equator, mostly is. And interesting enough, even though to the north of it, by the way, French colony, like I said, to the north of it we have Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is not below the equator for the most part. So there you go. Fun fact, or terrible fact, I don't know. You can take that either way you want. Next up, we're going to move on to the fact that we have Tanzania right here. I want to mention Tanzania because Tanzania is famous for being a different name. Part of Tanzania, it was two colonies that combined, two British colonies, and one of them was Zanzibar. And do you ever hear the word Zanzibar and you're like, so where'd that come from? It was one of the two countries that formed into Tanzania, except again, it's not widely known. I didn't know about it, so maybe I saved you and you're like, oh yeah, Zanzibar, that's Tanzania. Yeah, want to go to Zanzibar? Go to Tanzania. And you know, I want to go to Tanzania partially, maybe like 10% more, just because I know that it's called like partially Zanzibar. It's like, ooh, that's got some culture to it. The Zanzibar hoax and all these other things, it's from Tanzania. So let's talk a little bit of geography, because we've mostly been talking about history and fun facts and stuff. So yeah, geography with Tanzania. It does contain Mount Kilimanjaro. It is worth mentioning, which you know because it's either a famous mountain or because you listen to Toto Africa, whichever one it is. Also, they have one of the very few lakes in the world, which is divided by 3 countries. Also, they have 3 lakes, one at each of their extremities. Basically, Tanzania is like close to being an island in some ways, even though it's very clearly connected to a huge blob of land. They have a lake to their south, a lake to their west, a lake to their north, and obviously the huge, thing to their east. Also, there's a city called Zanzibar here. Isn't that a fun fact? So, yeah, with that said, that is Tanzania. Let's talk about Rwanda. So, Rwanda, I'll just be nice and quick because it's a fairly small country. Like some surprising fact about my other interest, flying a lot. So, Rwanda is their airline. Like the name, by the way, Rwanda. It's a catchy little thing. So, their airline is kind of cool. It's just universally rated as like one of the best African airlines, because airlines in Africa are generally just known as like below par. Again, I don't know if that's too offensive to you, but it is how it seems to be. But Rwanda is meant to be really good. Check it out sometime. What you might not want to check out is Burundi, because Burundi has the world's lowest rating on the World's Happiness Index, which is pretty sad if you ask me. Forgive the fun. So with that said, let's move on to the next few countries, because we've got Malawi over here. Malawi is one of the countries which has most of its area taken up by a lake in the world. A third of its land area is taken up by the Lake Malawi, which is named after. Well, it doesn't even get all of Malawi to itself, which is kind of tragic if you ask me, but there you go. There's a fun fact. Also, as you can see, 2 of the islands around Malawi, 2 of the islands which aren't in the Malawi area, but are instead in Mozambique, belong to Malawi, because that's how it's a really weird, enclave-exclave situation, but it's a water border, so does it still count? You tell me. It's kind of interesting though, to me at least, so maybe it's to you. Speaking of Mozambique, we're going to be talking about Mozambique's flag, because again, these fun facts, they don't have to follow a set theme. We've gone from airlines to happiness to lakes to now talking about flags. So let me show you the Mozambique flag, because what I want to talk about with it will become immediately obvious. So the Mozambique flag is famous for having something no other flag has. You might be like, what is that? Is that a red triangle, some black, green, yellow combo, which I've noted, or green, black, yellow combo? It's not any of those things. It's the AK-47. There are 3 flags in the world which have a firearm, and the other 2 are like super old, rifles with, things. This is an AK-47. This is the world's, most used. I don't know what this is doing here, but I do know it's kind of interesting. So yeah, there you go. Mozambique's flag is one of the only ones in the world to have a literal firearm, and especially an AK-47, and it's just a really weird flag because of that. Like, again, just know in your head what country has the coolest flag. Either the least cool, or the coolest, or the most sad, or the most tragic, or just the most interesting. Mozambique has got you covered all the way here in East Africa. So, moving on from Mozambique, let's talk about Zambia and Zimbabwe, because both countries actually used to be part of a former colony, British Rhodesia. As a mildly fun fact, my granddad, obviously he's like pretty British, and he's lived, he's like 70 something. He still refers to like them in the news as British Rhodesia. I thought that was a fun fact. Maybe you hate him for that. Maybe you hate me for being, related to him for that. You shouldn't. That's mean. But yeah, just a little fun fact about you. But yeah, with that said, Zambia to the north, one of the weirdest shaped countries in the world. As you can see, it's like this. The reason for this is natural borders, the whole river thing. Obviously the DRC, when it was just a personal possession, it was like, I want some land to hunt. We just go all the way down to the river. And as you can see, that whole thing led to one of the messiest border situations in the world. It's fine because it's Africa, though. Question mark, question mark. Side note, it's got to be worth mentioning that Africa is one of the most dense countries in terms of population in the world. So next up, we have Zimbabwe. I've been doing a lot of research into English-speaking countries and into the Commonwealth, because future video, it's just one of those interests, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to keep diving into this one. And Zimbabwe is one of the very few countries to leave the Commonwealth. Do you want to know why they left the Commonwealth? Because they said that it was neo-colonialism and that, it's the white people keeping Zimbabwe down. And, it's suspicious that, Zimbabwe's economy collapsed shortly after that. Clearly, it's the Queen's doing. It's the white people conspiracy to keep Zimbabwe down. As you can tell, I'm being very serious right now, and I definitely believe that. It's worth noting I have Zimbabwean friends who hate the regime and hate all the things that have happened there, because a lot of people, when hyperinflation happens in a country like Zimbabwe, which is, by the way, the most famous example of hyperinflation, the joke of like, oh, 1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, that's basically a real thing. It's more real than that, but they redenominated it, so you never said a trillion. But still, Zimbabwe, awful example of hyperinflation, and there are some people, on YouTube even, who have been defending countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Hyperinflation's really good because, it hurts the rich the most. And it's like, you can't just say you're going to hurt the rich the most, because the friend, again, I have a Zimbabwean friend. I assume he was rich in Zimbabwe by their standards, by the fact that, he's rich by British standards, even. And the fact that, like, he just got out of there, whereas the people in Zimbabwe still are the people who can't get out. It's a horrific thing on so many levels, and yeah, trying to be like, well, it's okay, because, white people did bad things before. It's like, no, never! The two wrongs don't make a right thing. Definitely has to be true here, and hurting everyone just to try and spite people you don't like the most definitely isn't a good idea, and Zimbabwe, look into it sometime if you want to see why not. So, with that said, Angry Toy Cat rant out of the way, let's talk about Angola. So, Angola has, again, airline talk, has one of the most interesting airlines in the world that actually flies to a surprising number of destinations in Europe. But yeah, Angola, former Portuguese colony, if I'm not mistaken, alongside Mozambique. It's one of those weird things where, like, Portugal has a surprising number of African colonies, but Luanda is famous as a city for being the most expensive city to live in the world. If you look up most expensive cities, it'll be like, okay, expectable, like, oh yeah, so you're gonna find some Japanese city, you're gonna find Switzerland cities, you're gonna find, like, Singapore, you're gonna find a bunch of cities up there that are really expensive to live in, and then at the top of every single list always ends up being Luanda. And then some articles that want to kind of hide the truth a little bit from you will say, oh yeah, so if you look at the price of a pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream, it's like $20. If you look up the price of a 2-bedroom flat, it's like $6,000. It's absurd if you want to get basic necessities by Western standards, but the truth behind that is the index that decides Luanda is the most expensive city. Again, a random African city is more expensive than everything else. The index that decides it is an index which bases it on the cost for expats. So if your company has to send you there and they want to give you the same living expenses, they will have to up your salary by the amount required for that. And basically, the reason they do that is so that you can have your same life regardless where you go. However, in Luanda, getting a comparable Western lifestyle is not easy. Like, the reason Haagen-Dazs is $20 is because who's buying Haagen-Dazs in Luanda? How are they getting it shipped there in those quantities? That's why it's absurdly expensive. There's a lot of things like this, like their country, they had civil wars, they have to rebuild it all, so there aren't many housing projects that are being built specifically for, expats, so it's really expensive. The local people don't spend $6,000 a month on their apartments, and yeah, it's just an interesting, thing. When people say Luanda is the most expensive city in the world, it's kind of true. Like, if your boss says to you tomorrow, want to move to Luanda, you need to ask for a lot of money to be willing to do that. But if, you think to yourself, like, oh, those poor Luandans, they can't even afford Haagen-Dazs or, a nice flat or a company, like a Mercedes-Benz car, it's like, in Angola, that is not the priority system they have in place right now. Fun fact. So, with that said, let's move on next to Namibia. So, I like Namibia as a country because it's interesting to me that it is a German colony. Well, it was a German colony. Obviously, they got their stuff confiscated for doing some bad things the first half of the 20th century. But yeah, Namibia is interesting because it's one of the very few places in the world outside, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Liechtenstein, or let's just say outside of Europe, where German language actually kind of took hold, and it's still one of the major languages there today. And in fact, a lot of Namibia is still named after German things. So this place right here is Aus. Again, I can't pronounce German despite having had a German girlfriend for all those years. All those months, maybe? I don't know. But, like, Aus means exit in German. Oh, look at that. Ausweg. Oh, look, there's just German all over the place. Look at all these places. They're German names all over Namibia. So, yeah, Namibia, slightly German, kind of cool. Also, used to be part of South Africa, which, we'll talk about South Africa now, I guess. South Africa, interesting for having 3 separate capital places. There's Pretoria, there's I can't say it anymore. And there's Cape Town over here, so that's kind of cool. Also, Johannesburg is like the biggest city, which I always thought was the capital, and you might think of it too, but it's kind of one of those things where it's like, there is no one capital, checkmate, although they do have a big airport there, so that's why you might think of that way. Also worth noting, I just spotted this on the fly, there's a Port Elizabeth in both South Africa, and also one in, that's Elizabeth Bay. Close enough. It's late at night as I'm recording this, so my apologies on that one. However, let's move on to the next country, because Botswana, over up here, is an really interesting country because it is one of the very few countries in the world that is doing super well in terms of, I guess, any real measurable thing. They have, their corruption is the lowest in Africa. Their GDP is growing super fast, and it's just like, Botswana, you don't hear enough about Botswana because they're not having these terrible tragedies. But Botswana, it's making a name for itself, So go Botswana. Everyone just give a quick thumbs up for Botswana. Yeah, go you. Have no corruption, unlike lots of the surrounding countries. So with that said, let's move on next to the island nations, because I'm going to talk about Lesotho and Swaziland soon. Actually, not right now. Switching the order on the fly. So let's talk about Lesotho. Lesotho has a king. It's a whole crazy thing. And is that enough of a fun fact for you? Their border is really close to South Africa. It's their capital, really close to the border with South Africa. Also, they're in the South African Customs Union alongside Namibia and Botswana and Swaziland, or we'll get into the name later. But that means that it's basically like the EU custom area, or like any other country thing, where it's just like the same kind of area. Makes things easy. They also all drive on the left side of the road. Another fun little fact for you. Next up, we have Swaziland. Most recent country to change their name. They've officially changed it to Eswatini, but a lot of places aren't changing it because they renamed it in such an arbitrary way that a lot of organizations just aren't changing it yet. That will become official sometime, maybe, probably, but we'll have to kind of wait and see on that. Next up, we've got the island countries. The biggest one is, of course, Madagascar. So Madagascar is a country that's, you know it from the movies with the talking giraffe that's voiced by Ross from Friends. Like that's how you know it. Let's just be honest with ourselves, jump that one out of the way, and say that, yeah, if you look at Madagascar, it's fascinating not only because there's a talking giraffe that sounds like Ross from Friends, but it's also kind of funny because, obviously, the people group diversity is huge in Madagascar. Like, you don't realize, one, the size of Madagascar. It's a mega island. It's one of the biggest in the world, in fact. But also, the diversity within it is kind of crazy. And, yeah, it's one of those kind of places that really is untamed in a lot of places because it's huge and it's not very populated, and the people that do live there are very much unrelated to each other. I've wanted to bring that fun fact up for literally like a year and a half on this channel now, and just Madagascar's never come up. So boom, checkmate. Madagascar's filled with so many tribes. Look how many different tribes there are. They're all referred to as like Madagascarian, but like this is complex. This is like a full-on continent style thing, and it's one country. So yeah, there you go. Get to use that fun fact and close this tab forever now. So with that said, let's move on next to because again, that's Madagascar. Let's talk about the other countries around here. So Mauritius is another island. By the way, these, again, French colonies, they're everywhere in this region of the world, and there's also some British territory up here. But yeah, let's talk about Mauritius. So Mauritius is one of those countries, which is, again, like one of the furthest east parts of Africa, and it's very, very close to Reunion, so it has a lot of trade with that. It's a former French colony, as you might be able to suspect, and can we leave that as the fun fact? I had a teacher when I was 9 who went to Mauritius on holiday, and when she came back, she was nicer, and she like gifted me a book, even though I never really knew her, and she was meant to be for like best student, and I definitely wasn't the best student, and I've always appreciated her for that, and therefore indirectly I've always appreciated Mauritius. Is that a good fun fact? That's a terrible fun fact. Sorry, it's just what we're doing today. It's 1:19 a.m. So with that said, let's move on next to Comoros. So Comoros is a island-based country. Intriguingly enough to me is the fact that Comoros and Mayotte, which is a French territory, they're deeply linked, but Mayotte is a part of France, whereas Comoros is this full independent thing. They had a referendum on, they all had referendums on independence, and Mayotte decided to stay with France, which I find that stuff just fascinating. Like, why did they want independence and they don't? Like, you can dive into it a whole bunch, but for today, we can't do the deep dive because we're instead talking about Seychelles. So, Seychelles, if you care about travel and whatever stuff, then one, this is the channel for you, but also, it's a kind of tree you've probably seen on some like places like, oh, this airline flies to Seychelles, wonder what that's all about. So yeah, Seychelles is it's one of the few countries where every airline seems to list it as Seychelles. They don't list that you're flying to Victoria, they don't list where you're flying to, they say you're flying, or Mahi I think is the actual place, they say you're flying to Seychelles, which I find is interesting. The second thing about Seychelles that's interesting is that they're doing really, really well. They have the highest GDP per capita in Africa. Is it Africa or not? It's some islands all the way over here, but let's just say it's the highest GDP in Africa, and I think that's fair. However, intriguingly enough to me, is any country that does really well in the international world, they get rich off it. The GDP per capita goes crazy high, but they also get a high income inequality. With the exception of Europe, the richest countries in any given region of the world, look at the Middle East, look at Southeast Asia with Singapore, is always a country that gets high inequality. But that means, even though the inequality is high, it sounds bad and it always looks super awful, and it'd be ideal not to have that. But then you see that even the poorest, like the poorest in a country like that, do a lot better than the poorest in countries where it's more equal around them. And it's just a kind of like key point right there that one, like inequality and like just because people are poor in relation to others, it doesn't mean they're not poor. But also it's interesting that although I thought it would be a trend worldwide that the countries that do the best in their regions, the ones that are most international, also are the most unequal, it seems as though some countries, like in Europe, do it the opposite way. So yeah, just kind of an odd fact. I figured it would prove a point at first, and then it kind of proves both points you want it to prove. So yeah, no real conclusions besides high inequality and high income often link outside of Europe. It's just one of those weird things about the world, and Seychelles is one of the best provers of that. So we have gone through a lot of countries today, but you better believe there's more to come because we're here in Asia right now. So one of my favorite ways to mentally mark the equator, because let's be honest, when you picture the equator, you assume it'd like go through China or something, half of the land's mass, but it goes all the way down here. One of my favorite ways to kind of mark the equator mentally when you can't see it, like right now, where's the equator? Who knows? Is that Singapore is one of the closest cities, or closest major cities, to the equator. It's just very slightly north of the equator. It's basically on the equator, again, like basically depends on how close your accuracy is, but it means that their season varies very little year by year. It's kind of crazy that way. And that if you want to mark where the equator is, just go slightly south of Singapore. And speaking of slightly south of Singapore, you know what country's there? It's Indonesia. So Indonesia is the world's 4th to 5th most populated country, depending on stats and blah, blah, blah. However, the interesting thing to me is the fact that it's it's the world's largest Muslim population in a country, and 2 is the fact that it's so diverse. So Indonesia, it's a hard country to even pin down on a map. This is Indonesia. So this is Indonesia, 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 and so on and so forth. And yeah, I'd love to talk about my experience with Indonesia sometime, because it's like one of those countries I'm like genuinely a little bit scarred from my experience with. Like I sometimes have like flashbacks, which is not a good thing. That's like unhealthy psychologically, because Jakarta. Whole story about that again. Sometime we'll go into that. But for now, Indonesia is one of the most amazingly diverse countries in terms of geographic and cultural spread. Every one of these islands has a different people group on them, and there's a whole huge spread. The only things that really link them together is the Indonesian identity, the fact that they used to be a Dutch colony, which is, again, almost as wild by itself, and yeah, also the fact that they have that kind of, like, I guess, religion and shared national identity. It's weird, it's odd, and that is Indonesia, one of the, again, also potential growing global powers, potentially for the future. So with that said, let's talk about Timor-Leste, one of the very few countries in the world which refuses to be called by its English name. It's East Timor, the east of Timor Island. If you don't know, Timor is an island divided by, you guessed it, Indonesia, and by Timor, and they don't want to be called East Timor, even though that's their name in English. They want to be called Timor-Leste, because that's who they are, darn it. Call them their thing in their name. I don't know how I feel about that one. Again, I've said I prefer English as an international language, not because I think like, oh, I speak it and it's all better that way, but because like, if we're going to have names, it's fine to want to be called your own name in your own language, but dictating what people in other languages call you and insisting that people in other languages use your language but only for your name. Some people from in the Middle East, not even people from Qatar, insist you call their country Qatar, and it's like, no, it's Qatar. Like, Qatar is acceptable in English. That's what we've all agreed on. They're like, no, I don't care how language and the rules of conversation work. You will refer to it my way. It's like, that's not how this one works. But okay, you're on the internet, so I'll just kind of fade away from this. With that said, speaking of fading away, let's talk about Papua New Guinea. So this is a former German colony. You can tell because the Bismarck Sea is up here. It's got a similar situation actually to Timor-Leste, where it's half an island. Again, Papua is divided between Indonesia and between Papua New Guinea. And they've got a really perfect border until this point right here, which is divided by a long river. So yeah, worth noting that Papua New Guinea is one of the most diverse countries in the world in terms of language. They have over 100 languages, almost 200. They have a lot of uncontacted people groups. By the way, New Britain, look how nice that is. But they have a lot of uncontacted people groups around there. I find that at least mildly interesting, that like there's still people to this day never seen the modern society. They don't know what it's like to have passed, the agrarian phase of humanity. And I don't know how I feel about that, you know? Like, isn't it weird that we have people, they don't know that I'm here talking to my camera, beaming it across the internet, and you're watching this, they're just like, you know what'd be great later? Not starving to death. That'd be awesome. That'd be just the bomb. And that, again, maybe because it's 1 a.m. though. So with that said, so Indonesia shares 2 islands with 2 other countries, Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea, at least in the Southern Hemisphere. They also share an island with Malaysia, but that doesn't affect us for today's video. And Brunei as well. Whole crazy thing, Indonesia and sharing islands, they apparently, sharing is caring, and Indonesia cares a lot, as it turns out. So, yeah, with that said, let's talk about Australia. It's finally here. The 2 countries everyone can name in the Southern Hemisphere are Australia and New Zealand, right? Like, no one's ever like, so Southern Hemisphere. I can name Gabon and Peru, but, ooh, what are those other countries out there? No, the 2 countries everyone knows are Australia and New Zealand. Again, at least in the English-speaking world of people who are probably watching this video. So, Australia, I kind of want to be like, everyone knows them already, so fun fact, I'll just give you wrong facts. In Australia, the language they speak is Australian, and over there, they also actually don't understand English at all. They've used to be a former Gabon colony, and, let's not do that. So, Australia is one of those countries that's so huge, it raises the question of, like, is it a big island or is it a small continent? And the world has collectively said, I don't know, and that seems to be where we are right now. So, large island is what we're going to go with today, and yeah, it's a large island that proves that we have way more land on Earth than we need. They have something like 0.000 something percent of the world's population, despite having a huge country, really low population density, lots of land left over. If you're ever scared that we're going to run out of land and you're going to have to live in a tiny box the rest of your life, buy a house in Australia, except it's crazy expensive actually, counterintuitively. So with that said, let's move on to New Zealand. So my fun fact about New Zealand is that it's 2 islands. There you go, fun fact for you. Except no, let me give you just a tiny fun fact, because when I went to New Zealand earlier this year, one of the best countries I've been to, by the way, I still have a New Zealand shirt just because of that. One of the things that I still regret not being able to do is timing a trip to, I wanted to go to Queenstown really, really badly. There's a lot of brilliant reasons to go to Queenstown, but I'm not here to advertise Queenstown as a tourist destination, except actually, let's advertise Queenstown as a tourist destination. So Queenstown is one of the furthest cities away from the UK. It's really high up in my I would love to go there list, but in terms of how can I reasonably do that, you can't. It's literally one of the furthest points from the UK you can make on a map. Seriously, it is, again, it's pretty much the furthest point. If you try to go a little bit further the other way, you can see you have to spin around the other side of the world. That's how far Queenstown is, but I still really want to go for a billion different reasons. Speaking of a billion different reasons, if you have a billion different reasons to buy things, if you have $1 billion, then you'll fit in well, because Queenstown has a really high millionaire population, very rich place, and even Kim.com, Mr. Piracy Man, or Mr. Man who runs a website that was just coincidentally used for piracy, lives there too. So there you go, fun fact, Queenstown, South Island of New Zealand, and it's one of the few things that's like super high in like my top 10 need to go back there just to do this countries is Queenstown. So yeah, expect to see me there at some point in the next like 5 years. I don't know why I looked at a clock for that. Didn't really need to do that. So yeah, that said, let's talk about next up. We've got the South Pacific Islands. So this mess of countries, honestly, to this day, I still sometimes get a bit lost where I'm like, which of these are countries and which of these are territories? And the answer is about 50-50. So let's first of all talk about the countries, and then we'll just vaguely disregard the colonies. Like New Caledonia, just, France. France exists over here near Australia. What are they doing here? Colonialism, empires or whatever. So yeah, let's talk about Solomon Islands first. So the Solomon Islands are one of the, they're one of the former UK colonies that are now independent. However, interestingly to me is the fact that they have an economy which is very, very low per person. It's one of the lowest GDP per capita in the world. Their healthcare expenditure equals out to something like $99 per person per thing. So, next time you think to yourself like, oh, we need to spend thousands a year, Solomon Islands spends $99, and they get probably very little for that. But yeah, no, the thing about Solomon Islands that's interesting is the fact that they still use shell money in some parts today. Money made of shells. And it's interesting that in the Western world, we assumed, oh yeah, the only way to make money is gold because it fits all the criteria. It's hard to make, but it's portable and it doesn't break too easily. And in Solomon Islands, they decided shells. And a lot of parts of the Solomon Islands, despite the fact that they have their own currency, the Solomon Islands dollar, the SIS with a line going through it, instead, even though they have a currency, a lot of people still use shells there, or the barter system, which is wild. Again, it's like the uncontacted peoples, where it's like, you know, you don't appreciate how not only far advanced you are compared to humans literally a few generations back, but compared to humans today in other parts of the world, the systems are so widely differently advanced. So yeah, Solomon Islands, can't say it's very high on the same list of places to go, but it is still on there. It's like, you know, it would be interesting. Next up, we've got Vanuatu, which I'm sure I horrifically pronounced, Vanuatu, which is one of the most interesting, recently independent countries. It's in the last 50 to 60 years, because it was founded by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Then it became a French-British condominium, and now it's, since it's gone independent, it's joined the Commonwealth. Again, really weird mixture of just things going on there. But yeah, this is a country which is a lot of different European powers. Again, what is Europe doing over here? Oh, oops. What is Europe doing over here on this side of the world, you might question? And the answer is finding some nice islands to settle down on. So, with that said, let's talk next about Fiji. So everyone loves a good Fiji, right? Fiji is interesting because the way you probably know about Fiji is tourism, right? If you are watching this video and you did know Fiji, you know about it because insert tourism thing here. And what I find fascinating is in the same way that Croatia is huge with German-speaking tourists because there's some amount of German spoken there and like there's just that weird link. Fiji is really big in the English-speaking world. And I know it's because people speak English there, there's the English link, but like, not every English person goes to every English-speaking country. A lot of English-speaking countries are popular with non-English people, the US and Canada, etc. But Fiji is huge with even British people. And to get from, by the way, Britain to Fiji, there's no direct flight. There's no even really easy one-stop flight. There's a few, but there's most of the time, you're taking a lot of stops to get to Fiji. And yeah, just fun fact for you right there, Fiji, chilling over here, has crazy tourism, but mostly from English-speaking countries. And then weirdly enough, it's like English-speaking countries and China and Japan and South Korea. That's like the list. And it's like, okay, then I guess that's Fiji and its tourism. But yeah, Fiji is also a country in its whole own right. I could talk about it for days, but I'm not going to because I need to move on to another country, which is Tonga. So the second flag I wanted to talk about today was Tonga's. And I'm going to present it without comment first of all. This is the Tongaese flag. That's what I've decided on. So as you can see, the interesting thing about this flag is if you look at it, you would assume, no, that Tonga was a colony of Switzerland. It's like, when did Switzerland get colonies? I feel like I missed something there. But actually what this is meant to represent, the cross is that of, it's meant to represent Christianity, because they're a very Christian nation. Again, despite existing here in the world, they are a Christian nation, and so they're like, gotta represent, Christianity with red. The white means purity, because we're Christians, so we're pure, and the red means the blood of Jesus. Again, it's usually most countries, red, I'm sure you're familiar with the joke, red is the blood of those who fought for the freedom of the country. In this case, red is that of Jesus's blood, because Jesus fought for the country, maybe? Yeah, the fun fact about Tonga's flag, this flag right here that you're looking at, is that Tonga is one of the few countries that have made it illegal to change the flag. It's tied into their country's law system that you cannot change the flag of Tonga. No referendums, no, oh yeah, let's update it. This is the flag of Tonga, and it is legal for them to ever change it. So in 100 years, when Brazil's going crazy and all the other things have happened, this will be the flag of Tonga still, which is kind of nice. So, yeah, with that said, let's move on next to talk about everyone's second favorite Samoa. I should stop doing this when there's two halves of a country. But yeah, let's talk about Samoa, because American Samoa, you might have heard about in one of these like, oh yeah, you know how America owns like random colonies all over the world? Guess what? One of them's American Samoa, all the way down here, surrounded by nothing else. But yeah, Samoa, which used to be known as Western Samoa, but updated to be called Samoa, is interesting for so many reasons. And today, we're just going to talk about the two ones that are most interesting to me, because they switched. They're the only country in the world in recent history to switch from driving on the right-hand side of the road, like American Samoa, which is America. It's not even like a separate country, it's just a colony. Samoa switched from the right side to the left side. So Samoa drives on the left side of the road now. And also Samoa is one of the very few countries to skip a day. It was the 30th of December one year. They were like, let's skip it. Go straight to 31st. And you might say, Soy Cat, why did they skip a day? Is this just like, are they doing like reverse Groundhog's Day? Or what's the scoop with that? No, so because the country wanted to do more trade with Australia and New Zealand and less, or not less, but like be better connected to those countries, because the Samoa lives in a very awkward place on the international date line, which is over here. I'll get it for you real quick. it lives in a very awkward place when it comes to the international date line. So, because of the international date line basically running right through it, it can pick which side of the globe it is on. Like, even though the times don't change, the day can change. They can basically pick, do we want to be today or do we want to be yesterday? Do we want to be tomorrow or yesterday, yesterday or tomorrow? Whatever you want to see that. So, basically, Samoa went from being one of the last countries in the world, you know, minus 14 hours from the UK, to being plus 12 or whatever. And yeah, just fun fact is that Samoa skipped a day once, and now, you know, there was no 30th December in that year. They just went straight to the 31st so that they could be on a better time zone for Australia and New Zealand. And that is crazy fun, right? In my opinion. So, with that said, next let's talk about Tuvalu. Everyone loves a good Tuvalu today, and Tuvalu is most famous for the .tv domain. So yeah, in case you think I'm going too slow here, there we go. Sped it up. Is that good? You like that? Next up, Nauru. It's a big hot button issue for Australians, but I'm not Australian, so no hot buttons for me. So yeah, Nauru is it's widely considered to be a client state of Australia. It's basically like a modern day colony in some ways, because although there is a population on Nauru, they are, interesting enough, one of the least populated countries on Earth, as you've probably seen in another video, and they too don't really have an economy because they used to have a lot of phosphate, very valuable thing. They mined all the phosphate and now they don't have anything else to do there. So what they do instead is Australia gives them a lot of money and they house detentioners from Australia. So people who want to get to Australia and it's like, you shouldn't be here, they send them into Nauru, and there's a lot of issues with that being, I believe, inhumane, but not really my place to comment. Australian politics, you work it out for yourself if you're in Australia. And yeah, Nauru has an economy that now is based on asking Australia for money and doing favors for Australia, which sounds like a relationship gone wrong, but it is what's going on over there. So next up, let's talk about I believe the final country for today. It is Kiribati. So Kiribati, it's Kiribati apparently, but you know, it's Kiribati. I'm sticking to that. My favorite thing about this country, I could talk about everything, but just to bring this to a light-hearted end, look at the names of the cities in Kiribati. We got Poland, we got Paris, we got London, we got Tabwakia, and we got Banana. Those are the names of all of the towns on their main island. And you know, I just love this. You know, look at the church. It's just called church. Everything about Kiribati and their names, I am down with, you know. I don't know how this came to be. I don't know how you get, you know, major European city, local name, Eastern European country, and fruit that I saw on the table this morning. But that's how they named that guy. I love it. I'm 100% on board. And yeah, long story short, is that Captain Hook Hotel is the only thing that shows up, by the way. There's no Google Maps locations here. It's just an island with fun names. And although there are other things about Kiribati that make it interesting, they own Easter Island. They've got a lot of interesting histories to them because they're the native peoples. It's a whole thing. But Kiribati, just bring this to light-hearted end. They have fun names. And you know what we need more of in the world? Fun names for countries. So I'm just going to make sure that I didn't check something, mischeck something by just going real quick scroll through the Pacific Islands. Because one of the things about the Pacific Islands, most places in the world, I could tell you all of the South American countries, all of the North American countries, most African countries, most Asian countries, easy on the top of my head. For some reason, the islands, because they're not distinct geographic locations so much, like the Federated States of Micronesia, like that's a country, I'm pretty sure. And then the fact that like there's a lot of colonies mixed in, it's like, oh yeah, so Tokelau, that's I think New Zealand. Again, on the spot, I'm not even 100% sure. You know, there's a lot of these weird kind of things to them. And like the Cook Islands, what are they doing over there? Oh, yeah, it's New Zealand again. French Polynesia? Well, I mean, that one's obvious. But there's just a lot of weird situations in the South Pacific because there's just this big ring of islands, basically. And yeah, fun fact, they're all really high up for the equator. There's this big area of no islands, big area above it. I don't know why islands formed in the places they did, but it leads to a lot of island groups. And in those island groups, this is the most confusing one in the world. So, sorry if my confusion is offensive to you. If you live in the South Pacific Islands and you want to tell me a fun fact about your country, make sure you email me. Also, because this is 48 minutes, before we go anyway, let's talk about my sponsor today, which is me. So, I am going to maybe be going to Paris. I have train tickets booked. It's a whole, like, I just have them and, like, I might be going. Long story on why. I think I'm going to Paris for a day. And if you have an idea, because usually I have a really fun idea when I go to places, like, oh yeah, this would be a cool video to make. Like Thailand, where I am right now, as you see this, because I'm recording this literally 7 hours before my flight. But I'm going to Paris, and rather than having a fun idea, like I'll have for Thailand or whatever, I don't have any ideas right now. Honestly, Paris is one of those cities I'm not excited to go to, but if you have a fun idea for a video I should record in Paris, let me know. I probably won't do it, if I'm being honest here with you. I probably won't do it, but I'd love to hear your idea regardless. maybe learn about Paris in the meantime. So yeah, oh, by the way, I should clarify, I'm going to Paris, France. Paris Kiribati, which is clearly, by the way, look, I can't even find it. Like, even though I just zoomed in, it's like, where is Kiribati? Okay, here we are. Paris Kiribati, even though it's clearly the better Paris, as you can see, it's a very... Thank you very much for watching this video. Give me ideas about Paris, not the Kiribati one. Or, I think there's a Paris, Texas too, right? Yeah, there's definitely a Paris in Paris, Texas. It's a pretty big place too. Like, it's a huge Paris. They've got apparently 25,000 people living there. There's a lot of Parises in the world, but I'm talking about the one that's close to me. I live in London. There's Paris. You can see they're close. Whatever, this video, the longer I go on, the more it becomes a wreck. And that's why I love this channel. Thank you very much for watching. Second channel. Don't care. Goodbye.